Chapter 4 of the Trilogy of Jessica Bauer plunges deeper into the complex and emotionally charged relationship between Jessie and General Waters. The chapter opens with a moment of unexpected tenderness that quickly shifts to raw vulnerability, anger, and unguarded intimacy. As the walls around their hearts momentarily crumble, both characters confront their inner demons and shared humanity. This chapter is a poignant exploration of grief, healing, and the confusing landscape of human connections. Chapter 4: Out of the Shadows. Waters noticed her red-rimmed eyes despite her smile. He forced his gaze away from her face and took a deep breath. He was struggling with the aftermath of his encounter with Timothy Bauer. Timothy wasn't Thomas, but he evoked memories of simpler days. Waters had every intention of going straight for a drink, but seeing her sitting on the floor with such a forlorn face reminded him of himself long ago. He stopped mid-stride and considered her. He didn't want to care. His frayed nerves were already making his neck hurt and his mood irritable, but the brave face she was putting on made him shake his head. He mumbled a curse as he crouched down. He pushed away the box and pulled her onto his lap. It felt oddly comforting to feel her warm body against his chest. She didn't move or speak as she felt him embrace her. As he tightened his grasp, she shuddered. "It's okay," he whispered. It's fine." She pulled away slightly as they faced each other. She rubbed her eyes with her knuckles and tried to explain. "They sent me my stuff." He nodded knowingly. Her eyes were still wet, and she seemed to be struggling to speak. "I just can't stop crying." She sounded embarrassed and wouldn't meet his eyes. Something unleashed inside of him. He was sent back to his family's headstones, Shelley's blood marring his hands, Thomas's gun pointed at him. For an instant, he was breathless, but Jessie sniffed, and he blinked. If there was someone who knew about grief and how to survive it, it was him. She was now sitting by his side, her arm brushing his. On an impulse, he squeezed her hand. Part of him wanted to lash out at her. He didn't want to be her caretaker. He didn't care about her woes. He only wanted her to warm his bed and distract him. But beneath his shield of indifference, he could not escape her pain. Maybe that was what people called humanity. He had no idea how to handle this newly awakened sense. His ability to comfort anyone had gone rusty. His mind kept going back to Thomas standing next to him through each of his heartaches. But Thomas had been his best friend, his brother, while this girl was just a girl who had unwillingly snaked into his life. He should have let her run. Now her pain mirrored his own turmoil and loneliness. The violence and fury that had been keeping him in motion today were fading away. The Bauers and the poison they spewed in his life were on the other side of this door. Waters' shoulders relaxed as he peered towards her. She was still struggling to keep her tears at bay, but in vain. She had the wild look of a wounded beast. He shook his head. "Okay, listen. Tell me something about your childhood." His voice sounded raw. His words didn't have the desired effect as a sob escaped her mouth. He pulled her closer, and her face was nestled against his chest. Thinking about his own childhood was like escaping to a happy place, but he had forgotten that her own childhood had probably been torn apart. He could feel her tears through his uniform. The collar was scratching his neck, but he didn't dare move. Her body was still and stiff. Women didn't cry on General Waters' uniform unless they were begging for something. This working girl wasn't even asking him for something. She was just crying. His mind foggily went back to those years that he never thought about. Memories of Allie and Helen nursing heartbreaks, or even PMS with tubs of ice cream, movies, and lots of hugging and crying. His face was pale and his voice quivering when he tried again. "I had 2 sisters growing up. Every time they were sad, they would eat ice cream. Do you want some? I've made them keep some ice for my drinks. They can whip up some good." She barely noticed the effort behind his words, or the eerie kindness in his eyes. "I don't want fucking food," she bit back. Jessie tried to scramble away from him but couldn't escape his iron hold. Once General Theodore Waters had set his mind to something, nobody could undermine him, even if the task was to dry the tears of a pain-in-the-ass girl. "I know. It won't change anything. It won't bring back all that you lost. Your family or..." He wasn't looking at her anymore and had that same far-off voice of someone unburdening himself to a priest or a therapist. She struggled harder and screeched, "It's all your fault!" The moment was gone. He let go of her and gawked at her. She didn't cower away, and her eyes were glowing with anger and the remnants of tears. At least she wasn't crying anymore. Seriously? Come on. You can't blame all the world's problems on me. He sneered to cover his embarrassment at being rejected when he was offering kindness or, as he would prefer to describe it, being weak. Jessie's lips twitched as she held back the words she wanted to hurl at him. I'm Jessie Bauer. You have my whole family in custody. It's your fault. But no matter how vulnerable she was feeling, her preservation instinct never failed. Besides, her family was a surreal concept. But he was here. She could smell his manly scent, the starch of his uniform, and something like pine trees. She was within his reach and could feel the warmth of his body. He was real and alive, and he had held her when she had been unable to stop her body from shivering and crying. He was real, and he was here. Hesitantly, her hand cupped his cheek, and he blinked, but their gazes locked. Her family was made of ghosts and made-up memories. Last night was close enough to let her remember how safe she had felt. In his arms. He wasn't her lover, but not a customer either. He was something else altogether. And right now, he could provide the only comfort she really understood. She kissed him. He didn't kiss her back, and she pulled back to look at him. Don't think it's a good idea, brat. Do I kiss like a brat? She wrapped his hands around her clad breasts. Does this feel like a brat? Hell no. His lips covered hers as he kissed her back. She kicked her blanket away and ravenously kissed him, her lips straying to his cheeks and jawline. He didn't resist her onslaught. They were too wrapped up in the moment to bother moving to the bed or even the couch. Their moments weren't fueled with anger, but rather with a sad desperation. When they came back to reality, the fire had died down and the floor was cold. Jessie reached for her blanket to cover them, but Theo's hand brushed the scar on her thigh and he mumbled, "How?" "How do you think?" she retorted. "I'm sorry. Not your fault. Happened a long time ago." Her hand caressed his right arm as she muttered, "You also have scars. But you're younger." "Clearly you're a seedy old man," she huffed, and he laughed. Waters stood up to gather her in his arms. Her first reaction was to stiffen. "It's too cold here, let's go to bed." She nodded and relaxed. She had to admit it was better than paddling on the freezing floor in her bare feet. At first they both lay on their side of the bed. They didn't fall asleep right away. Jessie was trying to ignore the guilt eating at her. This time, she hadn't been coerced in any way. He hadn't made any demands. She was the one who had initiated their lovemaking, not because he might want it, but because she needed it. Sex had rarely been about her. It was a central part of her life, but she had made sure it didn't mean anything. Stan had been the first and the last with whom she had been almost herself, and yet, now she was out of her depth. Waters didn't repulse her, but she wasn't supposed to enjoy him, find peace in his arms, or even like him. And yet, she felt contented when she nestled against his chest, and he wrapped an arm around her. Waters was glad to be in a hazy state in which no coherent thoughts strayed, wanting to comfort. Her he had to find his own solace. A sleepy voice interrupted his descent into slumber. "Are you going to punish me for today?" His eyelids fluttered, but he couldn't open his eyes. He was exhausted beyond words, but he slurred, "I haven't decided." He marked a pause, feeling her head rise, and he continued, "I don't think so." She relaxed against him. "Thanks." Hurried banging on the door startled them in the dead of night. "Yeah? What is it?" barked Waters. Jessie stirred next to him, but he ignored her as he jumped out of bed and found some clothes. Major Fitz had some urgent reports. He threw a glance over his shoulder and hoped that it wouldn't spoil his almost good mood. Jessie sleepily huddled into the warmth he had left. Jessie was sitting on her side of the bed when Waters came back in. The candle on the nightstand was barely giving any light. His mind was in full gear, and he hardly acknowledged her. He was pacing in front of the fireplace. He had to keep his mind sharp now that Thomas was in town. He was probably here for Timothy, maybe Samantha or him. He felt her gaze burning his back. "Why are you up?" he blurted. "I'm starving. I think I was dreaming about ice cream and fries." He had a hard time making sense of her words. He swiftly turned around with a face that betrayed his confusion. All he could think about was Thomas, war, Thomas, finding power in Thomas. And this girl was sharing her mundane preoccupation. "You're hungry at this time?" His eyebrows were raised, and a smile was tugging on his lips. She nodded vigorously. "You've never heard of a midnight feast?" He chuckled, shaking his head at the absurdity of having such a conversation after Fitz's dramatic performance. The man had been trying to pressure him to leave his city, and she was talking about food with such relish. From his vantage point, he considered the girl sitting in his bed, wrapped only with a sheet and her long golden hair. "It's actually a little before dawn." She crossed her arms in front of her, making the sheet dip and offer an enticing view of her cleavage. She was pouting slightly, and her face was a mask of confusion, the one she had every time he made a pop culture. Thank you for joining us for Chapter 4 of Trilogy of Jessica Bauer. In this intense chapter, we witnessed the complex emotions and inner struggles of General Waters as he faced the ghosts of his past and the unexpected vulnerability of Jessie. Their relationship takes a turn as both characters confront their shared pain and humanity, culminating in a moment of raw, desperate intimacy. In the upcoming chapter, tensions rise as new revelations and dangerous encounters unfold. Jessie and Waters must navigate their conflicting loyalties and the ever-present threat of the Bauer family's schemes. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the dark and captivating world of Trilogy of Jessica Bauer.